They called it the Eternal City, but eternity had its price. In Rome, glory was not bought with marble. Alone it was bought with bodies, lions tearing Christians apart in the arena, senators humiliated at feasts, children dragged into palaces, and emperors stepping into the sand to play gods. This was not rumour. It was a system, a theatre where cruelty itself became the currency of power. So who truly paid for Rome's grandeur? The chronicles often look away, but Suetonius Tacitus and Cassius Dio leave us fragments, and archaeology fills in the silence. If you value the historical record, subscribe, because when the ledger of empire closes, bones still speak. The Roman Empire gave the world roads, laws, and monuments, but behind its brilliance stood rulers who treated life as entertainment. For some emperors, punishment was not justice, it was pleasure. To watch was to rule, and to rule was to decide who lived and who died. Imagine standing in the Coliseum, the roar of 50,000 people above you, while a man is thrown naked before a lion. Or picture an emperor like Commodus descending into the arena himself, not to prove valor, but to humiliate weakened opponents in staged battles. These were not anomalies. They were policies woven into the daily spectacle of Rome. In this series, we will uncover the terrifying ways Roman emperors turned cruelty into theatre. From Nero, lighting his gardens with burning bodies, to Caligula, forcing citizens to sit through endless executions, to Tiberius building a palace of nightmares on Capri. Each story is a fragment of a bigger truth, absolute power. In Rome was not only political, but personal. It was indulgence without restraint, played out on human flesh. And yet, within these horrors, we also glimpse the machinery of empire, how entertainment kept the masses fed on fear, how spectacle masked corruption, and how memory still wrestles with Rome's contradictions. It was called damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. To Roman ears, it was not only punishment, but a form of entertainment as familiar as a chariot race or a gladiatorial duel. To those condemned, it was terror dressed as spectacle. Men and women slaves, criminals, and sometimes even innocent scapegoats were hurled into the arena stripped of dignity, armed only with the certainty of their deaths. What unfolded was not justice, but a performance carefully staged for maximum awe, fear, and applause. The practice itself reveals much about Rome's priorities. It was efficient disposing of undesirables while entertaining the public. Yet, it was also logistical, even bureaucratic. Captives were rounded up in provincial towns, or seized after rebellions marched in chains to Rome, and registered as part of the ludi, the games. At the same time, traders shipped lions, leopards, elephants, and bears from Africa and Asia. Hunters in Numidia specialized in capturing beasts alive, while caravans and ships carried them across deserts and seas. To populate a single festival, hundreds of animals could be imported their journey, as perilous as that of the humans destined to die beside them. Nero, perhaps more than any emperor, turned this machinery of violence into theatre. In 64 CE, after the Great Fire of Rome reduced vast swathes of the city to ash whispers, began accusing the emperor himself of arson. To deflect suspicion, he cast blame on Christians, a small and despised sect. Tacitus records how Nero subjected them to horrors in his gardens. Some were crucified, others sewn into animal skins and torn apart by dogs, still others set ablaze as human torches to light the imperial night. To the Roman crowd, these killings were staged as punishment for arson, but the cruelty far outweighed the alleged crime. It was a display of imperial authority, Rome's ruler proving that even in catastrophe he could provide both blame and spectacle. The Coliseum, finished a generation later, institutionalized this ritual. Seating up to 50,000, it became the perfect stage for damnatio ad bestias. Executions were scheduled at midday, between the morning's animal hunts and the afternoon's gladiatorial games. The audience knew when to expect them, a cruel interlude, as regular as the serving of bread. Suetonius tells us that these spectacles drew enormous crowds, not only because they satisfied morbid curiosity, but because they affirmed Rome's dominance. Here, criminals were erased. Here, wild beasts from distant lands were subdued or unleashed. Here, the empire itself performed its reach. Archaeological traces add texture to the accounts. Carved reliefs from amphitheaters in North Africa depict men bound to stakes beasts lunging at them. Graffiti from Pompeii mocks victims, showing stick figures chased by lions. Even iron collars inscribed with Servus Puino, slave of punishment, have been unearthed, likely belonging to those destined for the arena. These fragments remind us that the cruelty was not myth. It was systematized, advertised, and remembered in stone. But what did the audience feel? Ancient sources suggest a spectrum: gasps of fear, cheers of approval, even boredom. Cicero once wrote disdainfully of how crowds grew restless without novelty. By the imperial era, the novelty was not whether someone would die, but how. Was it a lion tearing a man limb from limb, a bear mauling a chained woman, or an elephant trampling a criminal underfoot? Variation itself was part of the entertainment economy, and so the victims became props in a performance bigger than themselves. Their screams mingled with the roars of beasts and the thunder of applause. Their blood-stained sand that would be raked clean before the next act. Rome had perfected a grim formula: cruelty as diversion, death as proof of imperial control, spectacle as glue to hold society together. To rebel against Rome meant annihilation. To displease its rulers meant humiliation in the arena. The lesson was clear-etched into every corpse left on the sand. Survival came through obedience, submission, and silence. Yet even as we reconstruct these spectacles through Tacitus's biting prose, Suetonius's anecdotes, and scattered archaeological evidence, one truth remains unavoidable. For Rome, killing was never only about punishment, it was about performance. And when emperors sat in their gilded seats watching men and beasts collide, they were not only rulers of an empire, but directors of its most horrifying stage. Gladiatorial combat was Rome's most famous theatre of blood, a ritual of violence that bound together emperor, people, and empire. At its heart lay the illusion of courage, skill, and honor. Gladiators, men trained to kill or die, embodied the virtues Rome claimed for itself: discipline, valor, control of fate. But under the reign of Commodus, the spectacle lost its fragile veneer of dignity. What had once been a brutal form of sport became the personal stage of a man who demanded to be adored, not as emperor, but as god. Commodus's obsession with the arena was legendary. He fancied himself the reincarnation of Hercules, striding into combat with a club and lion skin, his body glistening with oil, his image carefully crafted for the crowd. Cassius Dio, who witnessed his reign, could scarcely hide his disgust. The emperor appeared not as a warrior, but as a parody of one. gladiators forced to face him were often injured, starved, or deliberately weakened, ensuring that Commodus would emerge victorious. His victories were not triumphs of skill, but of power tilted beyond question. Rome's ruler could rewrite the script of death, and no opponent dared resist. Yet the theatrics went further. Commodus took pleasure in killing not only men, but beasts. In one day alone, sources claim he slaughtered 100 lions. On another, he paraded giraffes, elephants, and exotic animals into the arena, dispatching them with spears or arrows from a raised platform. The image was clear. Commodus did not merely rule Rome, he ruled nature itself. The empire's vast geography, its deserts, forests, and plains, was collapsed into the coliseum, where creatures from Africa and Asia bled onto Roman sand. Each kill reaffirmed not just his dominance, but the reach of Roman power across continents. The audience's reaction was complex. Some cheered, intoxicated by the pageantry. Others recoiled in private, disturbed by the emperor's need to soil himself with blood. Gladiatorial games had always been paradoxical. Rome's elite derided them as vulgar, even as they funded them to secure popularity. But an emperor descending into the sand violated an unspoken order. The ruler was meant to preside above the crowd, not perform for it. By fighting in the arena, Commodus blurred the line between master and entertainer, emperor and spectacle. In his mind, he was Hercules among mortals. In the eyes of many senators, he was degrading the dignity of the purple. Behind the cruelty lay logistics. Gladiators were trained in special schools, or ludi maintained by the state or private entrepreneurs. Contracts detailed their obligations. Physicians patched their wounds. Trainers drilled them daily. They were not free, but they were investments. Their deaths were calculated their survival even more so, since a skilled gladiator could draw repeat crowds. Commodus disrupted this economy by demanding staged victories and pointless massacres. What the system preserved for years, he squandered in hours, turning careful spectacle into personal theatre. Still, the blood fed a deeper hunger. Romans craved spectacle, not only for entertainment, but for reassurance. To see a man face death in the arena, whether bravely or in terror, was to glimpse the limits of human endurance. To watch beasts felled by human hands was to confirm mankind's mastery over nature. And to see the emperor himself in the sand was to witness divine power made flesh, however grotesque the performance. Yet, Commodus's obsession left stains that no amount of applause could cleanse. His reign became synonymous with spectacle, devoid of purpose, cruelty without limit. He did not wield the arena to uphold Rome's order, but to gratify his vanity. By the time conspirators struck him down in 192 CE, strangled in his bath by a wrestler, his legacy was already bound to the Coliseum's sand. He had turned Rome's most sacred ritual of violence into a circus of ego, and in doing so revealed the fragile line between emperor as guardian of tradition and emperor as its greatest desecrator. The stage of blood had always been Rome's mirror. Under Commodus, it reflected not courage or endurance, but madness in imperial form. The gladiator's oath was simple: to be burned, to be bound, to be beaten, to be slain by the sword. In Commodus's Rome, that oath no longer belonged to the gladiators alone. It was Rome itself, bound and beaten under the whims of a man who demanded applause as if it were divine worship. If punishment is meant to correct, then what Rome's most infamous emperors staged was something else entirely. Under men like Caligula and Nero, cruelty was not an unfortunate byproduct of law. It was deliberately transformed into performance. a carefully arranged spectacle meant to entertain the masses, terrify the political elite, and reinforce the emperor's absolute dominance. Take Caligula. Ancient sources like Suetonius describe a man who delighted in cruelty for its own sake, but also for its dramatic effect. Executions under his watch were no simple matter of justice delivered in haste. They were day-long affairs, orchestrated like theatre. Citizens invited to the games could not leave until the last condemned man had been tortured and killed. The arena, a space that should have represented the civic order of Rome, became instead an extension of the emperor's whim. The condemned were paraded out, sometimes starved, sometimes mutilated, to draw out the agony. Spectators were forced to watch every stage of the torment, their disgust mingling with a darker fascination. Caligula was not only punishing criminals, he was instructing Rome on the new reality of power. His power. And then there was Nero, whose reputation for grotesque cruelty was sealed in the aftermath of the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE. With suspicion falling on him for the blaze, he needed scapegoats. He chose the small, unpopular Christian sect, branding them arsonists. The punishments he devised were almost unimaginable. Tacitus writes with restrained horror about the emperor's gardens where Christians were crucified, mauled by wild animals, or soaked in pitch and set ablaze to serve as human torches for his nighttime feasts. The laughter of revelers mixed with the screams of the dying, and the flickering light of burning bodies illuminated imperial banquets. It was punishment twisted into grotesque art cruelty, wrapped in the trappings of celebration. For Nero, this was propaganda. The message that he alone could decide who lived, who died, and how their deaths would be remembered. What makes these spectacles even more chilling is the degree of organization behind them. Torture as theatre required planning. Animals had to be procured. Executioners trained arenas, prepared, audiences summoned. Public suffering became a logistical enterprise woven into the empire's entertainment economy. It was not a lapse of morality, it was a system. Rome's own laws, which in earlier centuries had treated execution as a solemn civic penalty, were now being bent into instruments of display. The line between justice and theatre vanished. Philosophers were not blind to this. Seneca himself, a witness to the gladiatorial games and a tutor to Nero, wrote of the corruption of Roman crowds who, once exposed to constant bloodshed, lost their capacity for compassion. What use is mercy, he asked, when every day one learns to kill? The implication was clear. Cruelty, staged for spectacle, was reshaping Roman society itself, dulling empathy and teaching that pain could be enjoyed rather than alleviated. Yet, the crowds kept coming. Why? Because these spectacles served a dual function. To the masses, they were distraction bread and circuses. To the elites, they were warnings, silent reminders of the emperor's power. In an empire held together by force, cruelty was political language. The condemned body became a stage upon which the emperor's authority was written. Consider also how memory amplified the effect. Reports of Caligula's day-long executions or Nero's burning gardens did not stay confined to Rome. They spread whispered by envoys and merchants across the Mediterranean. The cruelty already horrifying in practice multiplied as story. Fear did not end with the victim's death. It lingered in the imagination of every listener, every subject who realized that the emperor's cruelty could reach them too. Modern readers often wonder if these accounts are exaggerated products of hostile historians eager to vilify tyrants. And indeed, writers like Suetonius and Cassius Dio sometimes blurred fact with moralizing. But archaeology has provided corroboration. In the Coliseum and other amphitheatres, inscriptions and remnants confirm the systematic staging of executions as entertainment. Tacitus himself, our senator, did not invent the sight of burning Christians. He recorded it reluctantly as something too infamous to ignore. The cruelty was real. In Rome, punishment was never just about the condemned. It was about everyone. Everyone watching. That is why torture became theatre. It reminded the public of the emperor's reach. It distracted them from dissent, and it cultivated an appetite for power displayed in its rawest form. The lesson was not justice, it was submission. Not all cruelty in Rome unfolded in arenas or public squares. Some of it was hidden, whispered about in scandalous tones, sealed away on remote islands where power became unchecked indulgence. Capri, a rocky outcrop in the Bay of Naples, became the stage for one of the darkest chapters of imperial excess. And at its center stood Tiberius, an emperor who, weary of Rome's intrigues, retreated into seclusion, but whose name became forever bound to rumors of unimaginable depravity. Suetonius, in his Lives of the Caesars, paints Capri as a place of twisted luxury. Villas clung to cliffs, their marble courtyards overlooking an endless sea. Yet, behind their walls, he claimed, were scenes that scandalized even hardened Romans. Children torn from their families were forced to perform obscene acts for the emperor's amusement. They were called his minnows, a grotesque image of innocence turned into playthings. Suetonius alleges that Tiberius trained them to swim between his legs as he bathed, transforming a private pool into a theatre of exploitation. Whether embellished or not, the Whispers took on a life of their own, cementing Capri as a byword for corruption. The island itself became infamous, not just because of what supposedly happened there, but because of what it represented. Capri was isolation turned into empire, far from the Senate and the people of Rome. Tiberius wielded absolute power with no witness but his inner circle. He no longer needed applause or acclamation, he had only obedience. And in that solitude, the line between governance and personal indulgence dissolved. Rumors of drunken orgies, forced humiliations, and grotesque sexual performances filtered back to Rome, where senators and commoners alike turned disgust into gossip. But were the stories true, historians debate the extent of Tiberius's alleged cruelty. Tacitus, more restrained than Suetonius, hints at corruption, but leaves details vague, as if even the act of writing them down was dangerous or distasteful. Modern scholars suspect exaggeration a smear campaign, amplified by Caligula, Tiberius's successor, who benefited from blackening his predecessor's legacy. Yet, whether fact or rumor, the stories persisted because they resonated with Roman fears, the fear of power unobserved, unchallenged, and unchecked. Capri was a mirror of what absolute rule could become when stripped of accountability. Geography shaped the myth. Capri's cliffs fell steeply into the sea, offering perfect sites for execution. Suetonius describes prisoners hurled from heights, their bodies smashed on the rocks below, while guards watched to ensure none survived. For Romans who believed in the dignity of burial, such deaths were more than physical punishment. They were erasures, denying both life and memory. The island's isolation magnified the horror. No escape, no appeal, only silence broken by waves. Even today, tourists standing on the cliffs can imagine the dread of those ancient victims gazing at the same horizon that promised freedom but delivered only despair. Context deepens the picture. Tiberius had ascended to power, reluctantly overshadowed by Augustus, and never fully secure in his role. By the time he withdrew to Capri in 26 CE, he was an aging man, mistrustful of Rome's political games. In his absence, the city fell under the sway of Sejanus, commander of the Praetorian Guard, whose ambition nearly toppled the empire. While Rome boiled with intrigue, Capri became Tiberius's refuge. But refuge in the Roman imagination soon turned into prison for others, and perhaps for Tiberius himself. What fascinates is not only the alleged acts, but how they were remembered. Tiberius became the archetype of the secluded tyrant, his villa a gilded cage, where morality drowned in luxury. Later generations spoke of him with a mixture of revulsion and awe, a reminder that power without scrutiny invites monstrosity. Capri became a symbol not of paradise, but of the dangers of unchecked solitude. Whether Suetonius's tales of minnows were grotesque fact or malicious rumor, the damage was done. The emperor who once ruled the greatest empire on earth was remembered less for law or administration than for whispered horrors in hidden chambers. The island outlived him, but its name was forever shadowed. Capri, a place of natural beauty, became in memory a theatre of moral corruption. And so the story of Tiberius on Capri lingers not only as scandal, but as warning. When power retreats into isolation, when no voice can challenge, and when the vulnerable are left defenseless, cruelty ceases to need an audience. It thrives in silence, in secrecy, in the echo of waves against stone. Capri was not just an island. It was the embodiment of Rome's deepest fear that absolute power unobserved would rot into unspeakable cruelty. Rome was a city of feasts, but under certain emperors, banquets ceased to be about celebration and became instruments of domination. In the hands of rulers like Nero and Caligula, the dining table was not merely a place of indulgence, but a stage where humiliation was served alongside roasted peacocks and overflowing goblets of wine. Food and spectacle became weapons, and every guest, whether senator, soldier, or sycophant, knew that refusing to play along could mean disgrace or worse. Nero's banquets were legendary for their extravagance. They could last for days, the air heavy with incense, the tables groaning under exotic dishes, flamingo tongues, stuffed dormice, rare fish from distant provinces. Guests dined not in comfort, but in awe, sometimes reclining on couches lined with petals while ceilings showered them with rose blossoms. But the beauty was laced with menace. To attend Nero's feast was to submit to his whims, to endure his endless performances as poet, lyre player, or actor. His guests, the most powerful men of Rome, were forced into the roles of clapping audience, their dignity diminished with every laugh they faked at the emperor's verse. Caligula pushed the humiliation further. At his feasts, he would summon senators' wives and compel them to perform degrading acts in front of their husbands, reducing Rome's elite to trembling spectators of their own dishonor. Suetonius tells of how Caligula delighted in turning respectable gatherings into carnivals of submission, forcing dignitaries to dance, sing, or crawl on the floor for his amusement. What should have been moments of refinement became arenas of fear. A senator invited to dinner could not be sure whether he would leave with his reputation intact, or if the evening would end in humiliation or even execution. The feasts were not merely about appetite, but about control. In Rome, banquets traditionally displayed wealth and hospitality. Under these emperors, they displayed dominance. Guests who gorged themselves, became symbols of excess complicit in the emperor's decadence. Guests who resisted were marked as sullen or disloyal. The very act of eating became political theatre, a silent referendum on the emperor's power with no safe vote but obedience. Wine flowed as freely as cruelty. Pliny the Elder recounts how Roman elites sometimes drowned themselves in indulgence, but under tyrannical hosts the overindulgence was coerced. Drunkenness was no longer choice. It was compulsion. To refuse a cup handed by the emperor was to risk insult. To drink too little was to signal suspicion. And when the night blurred into chaos, when decorum dissolved into debauchery, the emperor remained the one figure untouched by ridicule, orchestrating shame like a conductor leading a grotesque symphony. For Nero, these banquets doubled as theatres of art. He often staged impromptu performances, demanding silence and rapt attention, as if the empire's nobility were no more than paying customers at a tavern show. Tacitus describes the strain it placed on guests forced to applaud what they privately detested. Applause once voluntary became survival. Caligula, by contrast, cared little for art. His pleasure lay in mockery. He relished breaking the dignity of Rome's ruling class, reminding them that their power was nothing next to his. To strip a senator's wife of modesty, to make the Senate itself eat and drink like slaves, was a performance of absolute supremacy. And so the feasts blurred categories. They were not meals, not mere revelries, but orchestrated humiliations. Every dish, every toast, every obscene spectacle carried a message. Your body, your reputation, your dignity, all belong to the emperor. The banquets were prisons of velvet and wine golden cages where even the laughter of guests was forced. Archaeology provides haunting glimpses of this culture. Dining halls discovered in imperial villas, expansive, frescoed with acoustics designed to magnify sound, were stages as much as rooms. Their very design reinforced hierarchy. The emperor elevated the guests reclining in subordination. Behind the splendor lay an unspoken truth. These feasts remembered in scandal were not expressions of community, but of domination. In the end, the banquets of humiliation were not just indulgent episodes in imperial excess. They revealed the dark inversion of Roman tradition. What should have been moments of shared humanity became tools of degradation. And when the lamps were extinguished, when the music faded, those who survived the night, left with full bellies but empty pride, knowing that their humiliation was as carefully staged as any gladiatorial show. For the emperor's cruelty was not confined to the arena. It could be served cold at the table. Rome prided itself on ruling not only people, but also nature. Nowhere was this more evident than in the staged animal hunts of the Coliseum and other great arenas where the empire displayed its reach across continents by parading lions from Africa, elephants from India, crocodiles from the Nile, even bears from Gaul. These hunts, called venationes, were not casual diversions. They were choreographed demonstrations of dominion designed to remind Rome's citizens that their empire was limitless, that no beast, no land, no rival was beyond its grasp. Commodus turned these spectacles into personal theatre. The emperor fancied himself Hercules, reborn a slayer of monsters, and he made the Coliseum his private stage. Cassius Dio describes how Commodus would stride into the arena, clad in a lion's skin, wielding a club, and slaughter animals weakened or restrained so that the outcome was never in doubt. On one day alone, he is said to have killed more than 100 lions, their bodies strewn across the sand like trophies. He hunted giraffes, ostriches, elephants, creatures, captured at staggering cost and shipped across seas only to be butchered for the thrill of a crowd and the vanity of a single man. The logistics of these hunts reveal an empire at work. Exotic animals were captured by Roman soldiers, hunters, and traders, then transported thousands of miles along supply chains stretching from the deserts of Numidia to the forests of Germania. Archaeological finds show cages, chains, and shipping manifests carved into inscriptions testifying to an entire economy of spectacle. Ships outfitted with reinforced holds ferried elephants across the Mediterranean. Caravans trudged through mountains with cages of leopards. At the port of Ostia, great warehouses housed the animals before they were marched into Rome. For every beast that reached the arena, many died, along the way silent casualties of conquest. The hunts themselves were staged with a kind of grotesque creativity. Sometimes gladiators fought the beasts with spears or nets. Other times, unarmed criminals condemned by the state were thrown in as living bait. Nero had Christians mauled by dogs and wild animals after the Great Fire of Rome, turning execution into theatre. Audiences gasped, cheered, and shuddered as elephants trampled slaves, as lions leapt onto chained men, as blood soaked the sand. To Roman eyes, it was proof that civilization triumphed over chaos. To the condemned, it was terror disguised as sport. Yet, not all reactions were uncomplicated. Some spectators, ancient writers tell us, were uneasy at the waste of life. Seneca, though part of Rome's elite, remarked with disgust at the mourning spectacles where countless animals were killed not for necessity, but for show. Still, the masses came. The Coliseum could hold tens of thousands, and the promise of free bread and breathtaking spectacle drew them in. The emperor, seated above in regal splendor, watched as his subjects roared approval. Power was confirmed in the roar of lions and the roar of the crowd. Commodus's hunts embodied the distortion of Rome's ideals. Where earlier emperors used the arena to display imperial generosity, Commodus used it to glorify himself. His obsession blurred the line between ruler and performer, reducing the empire's grandeur to a stage for his vanity. Dio reports that Commodus even executed wounded men in the guise of Hercules, striking theatrical poses as if he were reenacting myths. For the Romans, Hercules was a hero who subdued beasts for the benefit of mankind. For Commodus, it was a costume, a mask behind which he hid his insecurity, wielding death as a prop. The symbolism was not lost. Every slain beast was not just an animal, it was a province, a frontier, an enemy subdued. To kill a lion was to proclaim Africa's submission. To spear a tiger was to claim Asia's marvels. To topple an elephant was to declare dominion over lands beyond the horizon. The arena was empire compressed into sand and spectacle, but while the audience saw glory, the animals were stripped from their ecosystems, their lives consumed by Rome's hunger for display. In the end, the hunts of dominion remind us that cruelty was not incidental to Rome's entertainment, it was its foundation. Nature itself became a victim of empire, bent into a theatre of blood. Commodus's staged heroics may have entertained the masses, but they also exposed the rot of a system where absolute power sought validation, not in wisdom or justice, but in slaughter. The Coliseum stone still standing whisper of it. Rome ruled the known world, and it proved it with cages, chains, and corpses. Why did Roman emperors indulge in spectacles of cruelty so extravagant, so horrifying, that even their own historians struggled to describe them without revulsion? The answer lies not in madness alone, nor in simple sadism, but in the deeper machinery of control. For emperors who ruled over an empire stretching from Britannia to Judea, power could never simply be held. It had to be constantly performed, dramatized, and displayed in ways that left no room for doubt. Cruelty was not incidental. It was a language of governance. To the Roman people, cruelty on stage was both warning and reassurance, a warning to enemies real or imagined, and a reassurance that their emperor stood above them unchallenged. The Coliseum, with its blood-soaked sand, was not just an amphitheater. It was the emperor's stage, where he wielded life and death with a flick of the thumb. The masses saw not only gladiators and wild beasts, but the emperor himself presiding as arbiter of fate. Every torn body was a reminder. Here is a man so powerful that even the strongest warrior or rarest lion lives or dies at his leisure. Roman writers like Juvenal coined the phrase bread and circuses to describe the strategy. Feed the people grain, dazzle them with spectacle, and they will forget their hunger for liberty. It was an insight into how fragile political loyalty could be transformed into passive obedience. As long as the arenas ran red, as long as the feasts and games kept coming, rebellion was smothered under distraction. Cruelty in this sense was not random. It was calculated pacification. And yet the spectacle of cruelty went further still. It was also directed at Rome's elites. Senators, equestrians, visiting dignitaries, all were compelled to sit in the stands, watching as human beings were torn apart, sometimes forced to participate in humiliations themselves. For them, cruelty was not only entertainment, it was a demonstration of their own impotence. They might govern provinces, command armies, or legislate laws, but in the arena they sat beneath the emperor's gaze, reminded that he alone could decide whether they too might one day be dragged into the sand. This ever-present threat blurred the line between audience and victim, weaving fear into loyalty. Consider Caligula, who once ordered wealthy citizens to attend games without leaving starving them of food and drink. Their suffering staged alongside the official program of gladiators and beasts. The cruelty was double-layered. The condemned died in the arena, and the powerful were degraded by being forced to watch. The lesson was unmistakable. No one, not even the highest in society, could escape imperial whim. Nero took this even further, using cruelty not only as punishment, but as theatre of propaganda. After the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE, he turned Christians into scapegoats, executing them in ways designed to shock and awe. Some were sewn into animal skins and mauled by dogs. Others were dipped in pitch, set alight, and used as living torches to illuminate his gardens at night. It was a spectacle at once grotesque and political. By making Christians' deaths into an unforgettable performance, Nero sought to erase suspicion from himself and redirect hatred toward a vulnerable minority. Here, cruelty served its most chilling function. It was a diversion, a tool to rewrite narrative, to control, not just bodies, but memory itself. Logistically, these spectacles were feats of empire. Exotic animals were transported from Africa and Asia at staggering cost, trained or starved to maximize savagery. Captives were carefully selected to ensure dramatic variety: criminals for execution, prisoners of war for mass slaughter, sometimes slaves or ordinary citizens for shock value. Behind every scream in the arena was a chain of decisions, shipments, and ledgers. Cruelty was industrialized, organized like a state budget. Even philosophy bent to this reality. Stoic thinkers such as Seneca, who once wrote of the degradation of the games, still accepted the emperor's power as natural. He described executions staged at noon when gladiatorial combats paused as pure murder, yet his protests were whispers against the roar of the crowd. Roman law itself legitimized such cruelty. Execution in the arena was a recognized penalty. Damnatio ad bestias, a codified sentence. This legal stamp turned bloodshed into governance. To the people in the cheap seats, cruelty could even look like justice. A thief thrown to the beasts was seen as receiving his due. A rebel crucified at the gates of a city was a lesson in loyalty. But justice was only the mask. Beneath it lay the deeper message: the emperor's cruelty was a substitute for the empire's fragility. Rome could not control every border, every rebellion, every enemy, but it could control the spectacle. And in that theatre of fear, the emperor reigned supreme. Cruelty then was both entertainment and glue binding together. An empire too vast to be ruled by law alone. It pacified the hungry, silenced the ambitious, and terrified the conquered. It allowed emperors to cloak weakness in magnificence, to transform insecurity into awe. And yet, it left a legacy that outlived marble temples and triumphal arches. For when we read the pages of Tacitus or Suetonius, what shocks us is not Rome's engineering or law, but the sheer scale of its sanctioned brutality. Cruelty was not the failure of Roman rule, it was one of its foundations. And as long as the crowds cheered, as long as the arenas filled, that cruelty ensured control. If cruelty was the stage on which emperors performed their power, then the historians of Rome became the unwilling audience who recorded it. Without them, Suetonius, Tacitus, Cassius Dio, we would have only fragments, ruins, and rumors. With them, we possess something stranger, a record both vivid and distorted, where horror is preserved through the lens of judgment, moralizing, and at times, political revenge. Their writings are not neutral documents. They are haunted, shaped by fear, fascination, and the impossibility of forgetting. Take Tacitus. Writing at the turn of the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, he was a senator who had lived through the reigns of Domitian and Nerva, who had seen tyranny firsthand. In his annals, he describes the persecution of Christians under Nero with stark restraint. He records how they were covered in animal skins torn apart by dogs or burned alive as torches in imperial gardens. His Latin is spare cold, almost clinical, and for that reason all the more terrifying. He tells us not of screams, but of the silence of onlookers of pity, mingling with horror of cruelty so great it backfired, stirring sympathy for the victims. Tacitus was not writing as a Christian. He was writing as a Roman senator, appalled by what absolute power could unleash. His witness is precious, precisely because it is reluctant. Suetonius, by contrast, delighted in gossip, scandal, and the grotesque. His Lives of the Caesars is a gallery of human vices writ large. When he speaks of Tiberius on Capri, of Caligula's sadistic games, of Nero's flamboyant cruelty, it is with a collector's eye for detail. He tells us Tiberius trained children to crawl between his thighs like minnows, that Caligula once ordered executions timed with meals, so guests could dine to the rhythm of agony, that Nero staged his own performances while Rome burned. Scholars debate how much of this is exaggeration, but exaggeration itself is a kind of truth. It tells us what Romans believed, what they whispered, what they feared their rulers capable of. In Suetonius, we hear not just history, but rumour elevated to permanence, a reflection of the empire's collective nightmares. Cassius Dio, a Greek writing in the 3rd century CE, added yet another voice. From the perspective of a man of the provinces, he gave us Commodus strutting into the arena, dressed as Hercules, slaying lions and giraffes as though it proved his divinity. Dio's account drips with disdain. He portrays the emperor as a buffoon, whose cruelty was as absurd as it was terrifying. Reading Dio, one senses the tension between admiration for Rome's might and disgust at the madness of those who sat on its throne. And yet all three, Tacitus, Suetonius, Dio, wrote under constraints. They could not speak too plainly while emperors lived, nor could they afford to ignore the appetite of their readers for scandal. Their works are survival strategies as much as chronicles. Tacitus cloaked his criticism in irony. Suetonius collected whispers as if to shield himself. I am only repeating what others say. Dio wrote from distance, safe in retrospection. Each man bore witness, but never without calculation. This leaves us with a puzzle. Were Nero's garden torches truly as Suetonius describes, or are they the grotesque amplification of gossip? Was Tiberius's Capri really a palace of depravity, or a legend inflated by senatorial hatred? Was Commodus the mad gladiator Dio paints, or an emperor undone by propaganda after his assassination? The truth is, we cannot separate fact from performance so neatly. What matters is that Romans themselves believed these stories. Memory became myth, and myth became legacy. Still, archaeology sometimes steps in to confirm the written word. In the sands of the Coliseum, amphorae filled with animal bones speak of hunts as extravagant as any Dio described. Inscriptions confirm damnatio ad bestias as a legal sentence, giving weight to Tacitus's account of executions. Villas on Capri show signs of heavy security and secrecy, consistent with an emperor retreating from scrutiny. The material world whispers where texts scream. The role of historians, then, was not simply to condemn or preserve. It was to shape how future generations would remember. Suetonius's scandalous anecdotes hardened into cultural memory. Tacitus's moral critiques became the lens through which tyranny was judged. Dio's disdain shaped how later ages saw Commodus. Even now, when we think of Rome's mad emperors, it is their words we are echoing. But we must also recognize their bias. Each wrote from a class wounded by imperial excess. Senators who had once shared power with the Republic now cowered before emperors who could strip their lives in an instant. Their writings seethe with nostalgia for a lost order, bitterness toward imperial cruelty, and yet fascination with its theatre. That tension is what makes them compelling and unreliable. To read them is to read history as theatre itself. Behind every anecdote, one hears both truth and performance. And perhaps that is fitting. For just as emperors turned cruelty into spectacle, historians turned spectacle into narrative. They were unwilling participants in the same cycle of control, caught between recording horror and shaping its memory. Their words ensured that we remember not only marble arches and triumphs, but also flames, screams, and shadows. They remind us that cruelty, when witnessed and written, never truly dies. It becomes part of civilization's memory, haunting each new empire that believes itself eternal. When ancient writers describe emperors like Caligula, Commodus, or Nero, they reach instinctively for the language of insanity. Madness, after all, seemed the only explanation for rulers who murdered on whims, staged grotesque performances, and demanded worship as gods. Yet, beneath the surface of these stories lies a harder question. Were they truly deranged, or were they wielding cruelty with cold calculation, turning terror itself into a political weapon? Caligula-born Gaius Julius Caesar, Germanicus became emperor in 37 CE. Beloved at first as the son of a popular general, but his reign quickly spiraled into infamy. Suetonius tells us he declared himself a living god, ordered temples built to his name, and even appointed his horse Incitatus to high office. Modern readers laugh at the absurdity, but for contemporaries, these acts blurred satire and terror. Was he mocking the Senate, demonstrating that even a beast could serve better than the nobility? Or was he simply losing his mind after a severe illness? Early in his reign, ancient sources lean toward madness, but political theatre cannot be dismissed. By humiliating senators, Caligula was reminding Rome that power now lay with him alone, not with the aristocracy. To call him insane may have been comforting madness is random, but perhaps he was precise, using shock and cruelty as tools of domination. Commodus, ruling a century later, offers another puzzle. Cassius Dio paints him as a buffoon who fancied himself Hercules reborn. Dressed in lion skins, wielding a club, he strode into the arena to fight gladiators, except his opponents were starved or maimed, ensuring his easy victories. He slew wild beasts in staged hunts, claiming divine favor, while the crowd watched in uneasy awe. To Dio, Commodus was ridiculous, unfit for power. Yet we must ask, was Commodus merely deluded, or was he manipulating Rome's obsession with spectacle? By casting himself as Hercules, he tapped into deep cultural symbols, the hero who labored, who conquered monsters, who embodied strength itself. Commodus was not only entertaining the people, he was rewriting the emperor's image from distant ruler to god performer. Madness or propaganda, wrapped in blood and fur. Nero's case is still more complex. Historians remember him as the emperor who fiddled while Rome burned, though the fiddle did not exist in his time. He staged himself as a great artist, performing poetry and song before audiences compelled to applaud. After the Great Fire of 64 CE, he scapegoated Christians, sending them to brutal deaths in the arena. To his critics, this was cruelty born of derangement. But here again, one sees calculation. By taking the stage, Nero blurred the line between emperor and entertainer, claiming charisma as a form of authority. By blaming Christians, he deflected rage from himself onto an emerging minority. His cruelty, though grotesque, had a political purpose to preserve his own image and tighten his grip on Rome. The difficulty in judging these rulers lies in the nature of the sources. Tacitus, Suetonius, Dio, they all wrote after the fact, with biases sharpened by politics. To them, an emperor who rejected senatorial dignity could only be mad. But modern scholars suggest something subtler. Absolute power breeds performance. To control millions, emperors needed not just legions, but myths. Madness was not always a sickness of the mind. It was sometimes a mask, an act meant to terrify, amuse, and awe simultaneously. Consider how cruelty functioned in Roman politics. Public executions were not private punishments. They were staged events with audiences in the tens of thousands. When Caligula forced citizens to watch long days of torture, he was not indulging random sadism. He was reminding the populace that the emperor's gaze could not be escaped, that their suffering was a spectacle in his gift. When Commodus fought in the arena, he blurred the boundary between ruler and performer, recentering the empire around his body. When Nero lit his gardens with burning victims, he transformed cruelty into a grotesque display of divine favor, showing Rome that even death itself could be bent into a performance. These were not acts without logic. They were politics written in blood and fire. And yet there is danger in over-rationalizing. For all their calculation, these men also indulged desires unrestrained by law. Caligula's paranoia led him to execute allies and family alike. Commodus bankrupted the treasury to indulge his arena fantasies. Nero's artistic vanity consumed the empire's patience. Political theatre may explain much, but excess still suggests instability. Perhaps the line between madness and strategy was not clear even to them. Perhaps cruelty, once turned into spectacle, began consuming its architects, dragging them into the abyss of their own performance. Rome itself seemed complicit. Crowds filled the arenas. Senators bowed, even as they whispered. The empire tolerated, even applauded, until the violence spiraled too far. Then, as in the assassinations of Caligula, Commodus, and Nero, the system corrected itself through murder memory sanctions and erasure. But by then, the damage was done. Their madness, real or staged, had already reshaped the meaning of power. In the end, whether these emperors were insane or cunning hardly matters. What endures is how they wielded cruelty, not as private vice, but as public policy, as theatre for an empire addicted to spectacle. Madness was not only in their minds. It was in the system that allowed cruelty to masquerade as rule in a society that mistook horror for entertainment. Not every emperor of Rome reveled in cruelty. To understand the extremes of Caligula, Nero, and Commodus, we must also examine those rulers who deliberately cultivated restraint, caution, or virtue. Their reigns reveal that Rome did not always require terror to function, though the shadow of cruelty always lingered. Augustus, Rome's first emperor, provides the clearest contrast. Having emerged from the chaos of civil war, he knew that stability depended on image as much as on power. Ancient writers like Suetonius depict him as measured, disciplined, even austere in his private habits. His banquets were modest compared to Nero's orgies, his public persona carefully sculpted as a restorer of morals and order. He enacted laws that sought to regulate family life, punishing adultery and encouraging marriage, presenting himself not as a tyrant demanding obedience, but as a father guiding his household. Yet, this moderation was itself theatre. By avoiding open cruelty, Augustus distinguished himself from Julius Caesar's assassinated ambition, crafting legitimacy through restraint. His very self-control became propaganda. Marcus Aurelius, centuries later, embodied another model, the philosopher king. His meditations reveal a man obsessed with self-discipline duty and the fleeting nature of life. While gladiatorial games and public entertainments continued under his reign, there is little evidence that Marcus sought personal thrill in them. His reign was marked by long wars against Germanic tribes, famine and plague, yet he met these crises with a stoicism that resisted cruelty for cruelty's sake. Ancient commentators saw him as the embodiment of reason, a ruler whose authority came not from fear, but from moral example. To his subjects, this did not erase suffering. The arenas still ran with blood, but it offered a glimpse of an emperor unwilling to indulge in the madness of spectacle. Even emperors like Vespasian or Hadrian reinforced this balance. Vespasian, who succeeded the chaos of Nero's death and the year of the 4 emperors, presented himself as a practical no-nonsense administrator. He taxed urine collectors to fill Rome's coffers and rebuilt the Coliseum not as a playground for his ego, but as a gift to the people, cementing legitimacy through infrastructure. Hadrian, meanwhile, chose consolidation over expansion. His travels across the empire, his building of walls and cities, projected Rome's grandeur without the grotesque performances of human sacrifice as entertainment. But to highlight their moderation is not to ignore the blood beneath. Augustus's so-called moral reforms coexisted with ruthless purges during his rise to power. Marcus Aurelius, despite his stoicism, permitted mass persecutions of Christians. Vespasian financed Rome's recovery, with treasures seized from Jerusalem, wealth extracted from the destruction of another people's sacred heart. Even Restraint carried within it shadows of violence, the difference lying in whether cruelty was staged as entertainment or masked as policy. What these emperors prove is that cruelty was not inevitable. The Roman system could function through dignity law and calculated moderation. Yet, the system also allowed, perhaps even encouraged, the opposite. The same structures that enabled Augustus to appear as a benevolent father allowed Caligula to terrorize his senators. The same arenas used by Vespasian to distract the masses became Nero's stages of horror. The office itself was neutral. The man who wore the purple decided whether power would be tempered or unleashed. In this contrast lies Rome's greatest paradox. For every emperor who sought to embody restraint, there was another who turned power into theatre of madness. Citizens could never be certain what face the empire would wear next, the philosopher on the throne or the monster. And in that uncertainty lay both Rome's endurance and its terror. The Roman Empire left the world with aqueducts, roads, philosophy, and law. Its ruins still impress visitors. Its poets and thinkers still shape our imagination of civilization. Yet, woven into that legacy is another inheritance, blood spilled, in sand, voices silenced in fear, bodies discarded for spectacle. The grandeur of Rome was never free. It was subsidized by cruelty. Consider the Coliseum still standing as an icon of Roman engineering. Tourists marvel at its arches and tiers, yet rarely pause to imagine the thousands who died inside. For emperors like Nero and Commodus, that stone shell was not just an arena. It was a theatre of control, a tool to remind every spectator that life and death hung on imperial whim. The phrase panem et circenses, bread and circuses, was not satire alone. It was policy. Cruelty became the glue that bound Rome's restless masses, buying loyalty with entertainment. The memory of the worst emperors, Caligula, laughing at executions, Nero setting men alight, Commodus slaying lions in rigged displays, reminds us that power unrestrained by law or conscience bends inevitably toward abuse. Yet the memory of others, Augustus's restraint, Marcus Aurelius's stoicism, shows that Rome could imagine a different kind of leadership. The empire was not doomed to madness. It was simply vulnerable to it. That vulnerability is the true legacy. Modern parallels are not difficult to find. States still stage spectacles of dominance, whether through military parades, mass trials, or curated propaganda. Leaders still distract their citizens with fear and entertainment, blurring the line between governance and performance. When cruelty becomes policy, History warns us the cost is always borne by the voicelesses, while the powerful record their own virtues. Rome's story lingers as both a monument and a caution. In the end, we must ask, do we measure a civilization by its monuments or by the lives it consumed to build them? The emperors who treated suffering as amusement hoped their victims would vanish into silence. But bones in the earth fragments in chronicles and stories, whispered across time, resist that erasure. To remember them is itself an act of defiance. If you value the historical record, its glory and its horror, subscribe and stay with us. Because when the ledger of empire closes, it is not the emperors who speak, it is the bones.